with your 80s slasher librarian. Today, the continuing story of Nightmare on Elm Street Protege, Chapter 4. Rebecca Larkin was still asleep when she sensed that something was wrong, very wrong, and she was out of bed and halfway to the door before she opened her eyes. She stopped then, confused and afraid. No, more than that, she was terrified. Something had pulled her out of her slumber, but what? An intruder in the house? Maybe she'd heard a noise, a thump, or the sound of breaking glass. Something that her subconscious mind had registered and then sounded an alarm to stir her consciousness to action. Or perhaps there was a fire, and she'd been awakened by the smell of smoke? She stood motionless and listened. All was silent. No shrieking smoke alarm, and no thumps or bumps. She inhaled through her nose, but she didn't smell any smoke. No fire, then, and no intruder, probably. But while her terror had ebbed to the point where her fear was manageable, she was still afraid. She didn't know what was happening, but she believed in paying attention to feelings. The rational mind, for all its useful qualities, was more than capable of deluding itself, denying the obvious, rationalizing away anything that wasn't easily explainable. But the irrational mind was incapable of such self-deceit. It felt what it felt, and because of that was often a more accurate barometer of what was real and what wasn't. Rebecca returned to her bed, knelt, and reached underneath. Her fingers found smooth wood, and she curled her hand around a baseball bat, drew it forth from the darkness, then stood once more. Not much protection, perhaps, but she refused to risk the karmic repercussions of owning a gun. The makeshift club would have to serve. She walked quietly to the bedroom door and opened it slowly, so as to make as little sound as possible. She emerged into the hall and, sensing no immediate danger, started walking, gripping her bat tightly with both hands. She lived in a small 2-bedroom, 1-story house, and it didn't take her long to check all the rooms and determine that no one had broken in and nothing was on fire. Reassured, but still feeling the lingering remnants of that fear that had woken her, Rebecca went to the kitchen. She turned the lights on when she'd made her first pass through, so she propped her bat against the counter next to the refrigerator and started the coffee maker. It was only 4:30 in the morning, but she knew she wasn't going to be able to go back to sleep tonight. Not now. She was dressed only in a flimsy blue nightgown, so while the coffee brewed, she returned to her bedroom and put on a robe. She wasn't cold, but for some reason it felt right to put the robe on. It was dark blue and covered with the symbols of the zodiac. Jerome had given it to her last Christmas as an affectionate gag gift. She ran her hand across the opposite forearm, feeling the robe's soft fabric. Jerome. Could this strange sense of wrongness she felt have something to do with her nephew? Maybe she didn't believe in coincidences, and something had urged her to put this robe on. Rebecca left the bedroom once more and returned to the kitchen. The coffee was still brewing, so she headed for the front room, which she thought of as her sitting room, for it was here that she met her clients. It was rather plain. The carpet was an unassuming beige, and the walls were painted to match. There was a table in the middle of the room with 3 chairs around it. The chairs were all padded, soft and comfortable, the sort of thing that anyone might have in their living room. A cloth covered the table and hung down almost to the floor, obscuring the legs, but there were no fancy designs on it. Certainly nothing to compete with her robe. The tablecloth was white, and though that meant she had to wash it quite often to keep it from looking dingy, she didn't mind. She liked the way the white represented purity of spirit and clarity of thought. It helped her focus and concentrate, and therefore was vital to her work. Her one concession to clients' preconceptions was a small crystal ball resting on a black wooden base in the center of the tabletop. It was nothing more than an ornamental touch, and one that she didn't particularly like, but her clients expected it of her, so she put up with it. The sole remaining object in the room was a polished wood cabinet set against the wall. Rebecca went to it, opened a drawer, and removed a deck of tarot cards. She crossed to the table, sat down, pushed the crystal ball aside to give her more room to work, then began shuffling the cards. She knew using the tarot was, like the crystal ball, a cliché, and she would have preferred to do without them in her work. When she first set up shop as a spiritual consultant years ago, She was determined not to reinforce people's stereotypes of psychics as amusing loons at best or exploitative charlatans at worst. But the fact of the matter was that the tarot worked for her. She didn't use the cards the way they were intended, though. For her, the cards worked as a kind of lens that allowed her to focus her awareness beyond the physical and open her mind to the realm of the ethereal. As she began dealing out cards and placing them face up on the table, she chuckled. Realm of the ethereal. She could just imagine what Lynn would say to that. Jerome's stepmother already thought that she was crazy. But if she ever heard Rebecca talking like some Ren Fair fortune teller... She finished dealing out 12 cards in 2 rows of 6, then set the rest of the deck down on the table. She never looked at the cards as she was dealing them because she wanted to view all 12 together for the first time, so she could more clearly see whatever pattern might lay in them. But when she examined the cards, she began to wonder if maybe she really was crazy. For instead of the Magician, the Fool, the King of Cups, the Knight of Pentacles, the Hanging Man, the Tower, and all the rest of the standard tarot symbols, each of the cards she dealt displayed the same image, Jerome's face. There was no mistaking it was him. The image was so detailed as to be near photographic quality. As she examined the cards more closely, she saw that the images weren't exactly the same. The 6 cards on her right showed Jerome as a smiling young man, but the 6 on the left portrayed a Jerome that was alien to her. His brow was furrowed in a scowl, and his eyes were narrowed and mean. His lips were pressed together as if he were clenching his teeth. His features, eyes, nose, mouth, chin, cheekbones, were unmistakably her nephew's, but the young man glaring out at her from these 6 cards was most definitely not Jerome, not as she knew him at any rate. The terror that had gripped her upon awakening began to return, and her hands started to tremble. She knew she was receiving a message of some sort, a warning that something awful was going to happen. Perhaps already had happened, to Jerome, but she wasn't sure what it meant. She reached toward the cards, intending to pick them up, returning them to the deck and reshuffle them in the hope that a second reading might clarify the strange message. But before her hand could touch any of the cards, the air was torn suddenly by a slashing sound, and all 12 cards were sliced in 2, though no cutting instrument was visible. As Rebecca watched, the cards were slashed again and again, each time accompanied by a metallic slicing sound, until they lay in tiny pieces on the white tablecloth. For a moment afterward, nothing happened, and Rebecca began to think that whatever supernatural manifestation had taken place here was over. But then, with a whoosh, the 12 tiny piles of cards pieces burst into flame. The fires burned fast, hot, and bright, like magician's flash paper. Before Rebecca could react, the flames had burned themselves out, leaving behind only smoldering scorch marks on the tablecloth. The card fragments had been completely devoured by the flames, but something had been left behind. The scorch marks were in the shapes of letters, 12 of them, and they informed a message far clearer than the dull images of Jerome they'd replaced. "He's mine, bitch!" Then, as if from a great distance, or perhaps only in her own mind, Rebecca heard the sound of mocking laughter. Chapter 5. "Man, you look like something the cat refused to drag in." Jerome was trying to open his locker for the 3rd time, but he couldn't remember his combination. Frustrated, he slammed his fist into the metal door hard enough to cause the buzz of conversation in the hall to cease and heads to turn in Jerome's direction. "Hey, it was a joke. No need to go in testosterone overdrive." Jerome turned to Ellery Belasco, otherwise known as Elle, and gave his friend a faint smile. "Don't flatter yourself. That joke wasn't good enough to make me angry. The truth is, I didn't sleep too well last night." Seeing the 2 friends talking calmly, the other students returned to their own business. And soon, the din of conversation was faster and louder than before, as if the kids were determined to make up for the few precious moments of conversation they'd missed. "I'd have thought you'd feel well rested today, considering you were zonked out on my couch last night," Elle said. "Though, how someone could possibly sleep through all 3 Evil Dead movies is beyond me." Jerome started fumbling with his combination again, but Elle pushed him aside and went to work on the lock himself. Within moments, Elle had the locker door open. He stepped back and gestured to the open locker with a flourish. "Ta-da!" Jerome frowned. How'd you do that?" "I'm afraid that a true magician never reveals his secrets," Elle said. "But if you really want to know, it's no big deal. I've seen you open your locker so many times I have your combination memorized." Elle was shorter than Jerome and possessed a slighter build. He had curly black hair and a thin dusting of facial hair above his lip that could only be called a mustache in the most generous interpretation of the word. He was long-sighted, and the glasses he wore made his eyes appear larger than they really were, giving his face a vaguely owlish aspect that made him seem more serious and studious than he really was. He was always full of energy, so much that at times he almost seemed to vibrate. It was a quality that irritated a lot of people, but not Jerome. Elle's almost manic energy had a way of defusing Jerome's temper, especially when Elle made one of his lousy jokes. Though Elle acted goofy, he always dressed well, and today he wore a maroon sweater over a white shirt, neatly pressed khaki pants, and polished brown shoes. When anyone questioned him about the seeming contradiction in Elle's personality, he always joked that he subscribed to GQ for dorks. Now that his locker was open, thanks to Elle, Jerome hung up his jacket and stowed his backpack. He was more plainly dressed than Elle in a slightly wrinkled red polo shirt, jeans that could stand washing, and old tennis shoes of indeterminate color. Jerome had never cared much about clothes, certainly not to the degree his friend did. He reached into his locker and took out the books for his couple of classes of the day: biology, advanced composition, and world history. "I don't know why you signed up for biology first period," Elle said. "Everyone knows you take biology last period so you don't smell of formaldehyde all day." Jerome smiled as he closed his locker and gave the combination a spin. "Maybe some people like the smell of formaldehyde. You ever thought of that?" he said. "And maybe some people like slamming their head in a car door over and over, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea." Elle's tone became more serious then. "So why'd you have trouble sleeping? You get in a fight with your mom again?" "Stepmom," Jerome automatically corrected. "And yeah, I did. I swear that woman is the lightest sleeper that ever lived. She probably woke up the moment I stepped on the lawn and bent a blade of grass." "Maybe," Elle allowed. "But did it ever occur to you that maybe she was waiting up for you because she was worried about you?" Actually, it hadn't. But Jerome didn't want to admit that to his friend. Elle wasn't like the stereotypical teenager in that he had a good relationship with his parents. Though he and Jerome had been friends since second grade, and though Elle knew him better than anyone, with the possible exception of his father, Jerome wasn't sure Elle truly understood his problems at home. Still, Jerome appreciated his friend's support. "I didn't have any trouble getting to sleep," Jerome said. "But once I did, He what? He'd been about to say something, but he couldn't remember what it was. It was as if the memory was there, but it was blocked off somehow, sealed away where he couldn't get at it. Weird. "You just need to learn how to relax. That's your problem," Elle said. "You're so intense all the time. You gotta lighten up a little, dude." Jerome grinned. "That's what I got you for, pal." "What about me? What do you have me for?" Jerome and Elle turned to see a tall brown-haired girl looking at them with an amused half-smile. "As much as I love a good straight line," Elle said, "I wouldn't touch that one with the proverbial 10-foot pole." Jerome felt his cheeks burn, and he knew he was blushing. Both Elle and Cheryl laughed. Then Cheryl gently touched Jerome's cheek. "That's one of the things I love about you, you know. Your feelings are always so close to the surface." Jerome thought about the rage he'd felt towards Lynn and his dad last night, and of the disturbing images of violence that had accompanied it. Too close, sometimes. "Nonsense," Cheryl said. "Too many people keep their emotions bottled up all the time. Not only can't you tell what they're feeling, half the time they don't know what they are feeling. I'm so glad you're not like that." Jerome knew Cheryl was trying to be sweet, so he accepted her words with a smile. But he wondered what it would be like to be able to control his emotions, especially anger, more effectively. Cheryl might think it was unhealthy to bottle up emotions, but that was because she wanted to become a psychologist someday. Being able to bottle up feelings, at least sometimes, sounded pretty damn good to Jerome. He gazed at Cheryl, and for perhaps the thousandth time, wondered how he'd ever gotten lucky enough to end up with someone like her for a girlfriend. She wore a dark blue sweatshirt that was a size too large for her trim figure, faded blue jeans, and a pair of scuffed black boots. Her makeup was understated, so much so that if he hadn't been her boyfriend, he'd have thought she didn't wear any at all. But then, she didn't really need much. She had a natural beauty, and too much makeup would have spoiled it. She wasn't gorgeous in an anorexic covergirl kind of way, but she had a glow about her. He supposed was the best way to put it. The kindness, the gentleness, the grace, the sheer goodness of her spirit seemed to shine forth from her, and that made her more beautiful in Jerome's eyes than any other woman he'd ever seen. "Do me a solid, buddy," Elle said to Cheryl. "I was nagging our good friend Jerome about how he needs to relax more. You know, he never listens to me, but if you nagged him—" Cheryl laughed. "Sorry, Elle, but I'm not the nagging kind." She paused for a moment, then frowned as she examined Jerome's face more closely. "Still, your eyes are bloodshot, and you do have dark circles around them. Maybe you should try to relax more, honey. The way you throw yourself into your schoolwork and your job, it's almost like—" "Like what?" Jerome asked. Cheryl looked suddenly uncomfortable. "I don't know. Like you're desperate to keep yourself busy, as if you're afraid of what might happen if you don't." Jerome wasn't sure what to say in response, but before he could think of something, a fourth voice joined in on the conversation. "Starkey doesn't need to relax. He just needs to get something that more closely resembles a life, that's all." The three friends turned to see Pat Cottrell standing in the center of the hallway, almost, but not quite, leering at them. Though Jerome hated to admit it, Pat Cottrell was one of the most handsome guys in school, if not the most handsome. He was tall, muscular, with clear skin and even white teeth. His sandy brown hair was always perfect, as if he'd just stepped out of a salon. And though he had a tendency to dress down, today he was wearing a black slipknot t-shirt and jeans with holes in both knees. His choice of wardrobe only served to accentuate his good looks by contrast. The only flaw marring his features was a puckered crescent of a scar above his left eyebrow, a scar he'd received in kindergarten, courtesy of Jerome. Standing next to Pat on the right was Eddie Jackson, and on the left was Brent Haney. Eddie was a wiry, weasel-faced imitation of his lord and master, down to the rock concert t-shirt, his band of choice being Velvet Revolver, and torn jeans. Brent also resembled Cottrell, but only if Pat had undergone a reverse liposuction procedure. Haney wore a plaid button shirt untucked, probably because, with his gut, he couldn't keep the shirt tail in. Cottrell, Jackson, and Haney, the three pusketeers, as Elle called them, but never to their faces. Elle might act nutty much of the time, but he was not suicidal. The sight of Cottrell's smirk sent a burning jolt of fury surging through Jerome. As far as he could tell, he didn't visibly demonstrate his anger, but Elle stepped closer to him and Cheryl laid her hand on his arm, as if to soothe him and help keep his anger in check. "Isn't it a little early for you to start busting my hump?" Jerome asked. "It's never too early to offer a bit of constructive criticism," Cottrell said. "If you didn't have such a loser job, then maybe you wouldn't have to work your ass off to earn your pitiful excuse for a paycheck. And if you didn't have to work so hard for slave wages, maybe you'd be able to find some chill-out time for yourself and for your girl. A fine woman like her needs attention, Starkey. Work too hard, neglect her too much, and she might just start looking around to see if she can find a better deal. Know what I mean?" Eddie and Brent grinned at their leader's display of wit. Jerome ground his teeth, and Cheryl took hold of his arm and held it tight, as if she were afraid he might lunge for Cottrell. Jerome wanted to tell the son of a bitch that he worked so hard because he wanted to pay his own way through college as much as possible. So he saved as much money as he could from his job at Showtime Video and studied as hard as he could so that he might land a scholarship. Going to Elle's last night after work had been one of his rare attempts to relax. And what had happened? He had fallen asleep, gotten home late, gotten into an argument with Lynn and his dad, and ended up more stressed than ever. But he wasn't about to share that much of his personal life with an asshole like Pat Cottrell. "You wouldn't be talking trash about our jobs because my parents had the good sense to fire you by any chance?" Elle's folks owned Showtime Video, where both he and Jerome worked. Pat Cottrell had worked there too about 7 months ago. He hadn't lasted long, partially because he couldn't get along with Jerome, but mostly because he couldn't get along with anyone, including the customers. "Not at all," Cottrell smiled at Elle, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Getting fired from that shithole was the best thing that ever happened to me. If I were unlucky enough to still be working for your parents, Ellery, I'd never have gotten my job at the golf course, and then I wouldn't be raking in all the sweet do-re-mi I make on tips." "You're a caddy, Patrick," Elle said. "You like other people's shit around. How glamorous." "Who gives a damn about glamorous?" Cottrell countered. "It's easy work. I'm outside getting some exercise, and I make more money than you two losers combined." He turned away from Jerome and Elle to face Cheryl. "You ever want to go on a date with someone who has the cash to take you someplace better than a McDonald's dumpster? You give me a call, baby." Cottrell turned back to Jerome and gave him a smile that said, "I can take your girl from you any time I want, and you know it." Jerome's anger, which had been simmering just below the surface for the last several minutes, came to an abrupt and violent boil. He pulled free of Cheryl's grip and stepped toward Cottrell and his two sycophants. Before any of the three Pusketeers could react, Jerome grabbed hold of Eddie Jackson's head with one hand and Brent Haney's with the other. He then slammed their heads against Pat Cottrell's with all the strength that his anger gave him, which was quite considerable. There was a sickening hollow sound as of melons colliding. For a frozen instant, Jerome saw the three Pusketeers' eyes go wide, heard grunts of surprise and pain escape their lips. Then their heads exploded like three flesh-colored piñatas, spraying the air with a grisly fountain of blood and meaty chunks of what, at least for these three idiots, passed for brains. Jerome felt gore gush onto his hands, splatter his face, soak his clothes, and as the three lifeless bodies slumped to the hallway floor, he threw back his head and laughed in dark delight. "You still with us, Starkey? Or did your so-called brain suddenly slip a gear?" Jerome's vision blurred, and he blinked several times. When he could see clearly again, he saw Cottrell, Jackson, and Haney standing right where they'd been, heads still intact. Jerome glanced at Cheryl, saw she had a worried look on her face, and saw that she still had hold of his arm. Frowning in confusion, he turned back to Cottrell. Pat sneered and shook his head. "You're a lost cause, Starkey. Absolutely pathetic." He looked at Cheryl and gave her a wink. "When, not if, you get tired of Captain Phoebe here, give me a call." "And just what would that number be?" Cheryl asked. 1-800-I'm-an-asshole? Elle burst out laughing, but Eddie Jackson and Brent Haney looked puzzled, unsure how to react. They looked to Pat for a lead, and Cottrell stared at Cheryl for a moment without expression, before finally allowing his lips to stretch into a slow smile. "Good one, Geringer." He glanced at Jerome and Elle. "Later, dorks." Then he turned and headed off down the hallway. Jackson and Haney in tow, each at his side, but staying a half step behind their leader. The other kids pretended not to notice them, but everyone made way to give them room to pass. "I hate those guys," Elle said. "I really do." In his mind, Jerome could still hear the hollow pop of exploding heads, could still see a geyser of gore rising into the air. "Me too," Jerome said. Jerome went to his homeroom after the first bell. He was still seething from his encounter with Cottrell, and he wished either Cheryl or Elle shared the same homeroom with him, but they didn't, so he sat at his desk, gripped the wooden surface of the table, and pressed his fingers down as hard as he could, until his knuckles turned white and his hands began to ache. He hoped that by doing this, he might be able to bleed off a bit of his anger. But when the bell for first period rang, Jerome felt just as angry as before, maybe more so. Without glancing at any of the other students in the room, or at Mr. Blakesley, his homeroom teacher, Jerome scooped up his books, jumped out of his chair, and ran to the door. He hoped to see Cheryl or Elle, maybe exchange a couple of words with them as they all hurried to their first period classes. Even just the sight of one or both of their faces would help to lighten the anger boiling inside him. But he rarely saw either of them between homeroom and first period, and today was no exception. The biology classroom was located on the bottom level of Springwood High School, and the hallway smelled of decades' worth of formaldehyde. To make matters worse, the entrance to the cafeteria was on that level too, and the smells of cooking food often drifted into the hall and mixed with the formaldehyde to form a stomach-churning miasma of stench. Some of the kids that Jerome passed nodded and smiled at him, and some even said hi, but most ignored him as if he didn't exist. Springwood was a small enough community for most of the students to at least know each other by sight, but that didn't mean everyone was best friends. But Jerome didn't take being snubbed personally. It wasn't uncommon for people to be inwardly focused, so wrapped up in their own problems that they were barely aware of the world around them, especially here in Springwood. Jerome had lived in Springwood all his life, and on the surface it appeared to be a pleasant Midwestern town nestled amidst picturesque farmland, only a convenient short drive from larger metropolitan areas. Maybe the people who lived here weren't rich, but no one was in danger of starving any time soon. Springwood was a place people moved to, not away from. The motto might as well have been, Springwood, official home of the good life. And yet, people often seem preoccupied here, worried, depressed, even afraid. Not all the time, mind you. It came in waves, like a bad flu season that rolled around every few years. People would become quiet and withdrawn, and many of them seemed as if they hadn't been sleeping well. Bloodshot eyes, the flesh around them dark and puffy, the biggest sign. Just like me, Jerome thought with a start of sudden realization. Something else happened during these times when, as his dad said, a pox, whatever that was, fell over Springwood. Death came to town. There would be a rash of suicides or murders, sometimes both, and then, just as suddenly as it had come, it would end, like a bad storm that had finally blown over. As Jerome walked into Mr. Hauser's classroom, he put aside such thoughts. It wasn't difficult. Anyone who lived in Springwood for any length of time got used to not thinking about certain things if they wanted to be able to function from one day to the next. So by the time Jerome took his assigned seat, laid his bio book on the desk, and tucked his extra books into the wire basket attached to the bottom of his chair, he'd forgotten about his dark musings, but their emotional aftertaste lingered in his mind. All right, class, you can make the first incision. Try not to be squeamish now. These animals are quite dead, all humanely euthanized. Several of the students whooped. One said, "Yeah," while a few others groaned in reluctance. Still, they all picked up their scalpels, bent over the dead frogs pinned to the cutting boards, and went to work with nervous giggles and muted ews. The biology lab was in the rear of the classroom, though lab was too grandiose a term. It consisted of 2 long tables with black formica tops, and built-in drawers and cabinets for holding supplies. The students stood in pairs, 2 to a workstation, as they began their latest adventure in dissection, except Jerome. There were an odd number of students in the class, so someone had to do without a lab partner, and Jerome, never the most sociable of people anyhow, was only too happy to volunteer to go at it alone. Unfortunately, that meant Mr. Hauser checked on him more often than the others. Before Jerome could touch the blade of his scalpel to the frog's rubbery white belly, Mr. Hauser was at his side. "Don't cut too deeply now, Jerome. You'll damage the internal organs if you do. You just want to make enough of an opening in the skin so you can peel it back and then pin it down." Jerome bristled. He'd paid attention when Mr. Hauser had first instructed the class on how to proceed. And even if Jerome hadn't, he wasn't an idiot. He had more than enough common sense not to hack the frog to pieces with his first incision. But instead of saying this to Mr. Hauser, Jerome merely nodded and made a non-committal sound. He didn't look up from the frog, hoping that if he didn't make eye contact, Mr. Hauser would wander off and go pester someone else, leaving Jerome to get on with his work. Mr. Hauser was a small, thin man who seemed to almost get lost in his white lab coat. He had short black hair, a neatly trimmed black mustache, black framed glasses, and a much too deep voice for his small build. His salt and pepper color scheme was ruined by his ruddy brown complexion, however. The teacher hovered at Jerome's elbow for a moment longer before finally saying, "I'll leave you to it then," and moving on. Jerome let out a grateful sigh. He hated anyone watching him while he worked, with the exception of Cheryl or Elle, and even they made him feel uncomfortably self-conscious at times. But this time he was alone. Time to play frog coroner. He placed the tip of his scalpel blade at a point just below the underside of the frog's mouth and pressed down until the tip dimpled the skin. He pressed a bit harder, and the white flesh pulled away from the metal as if it were a laser. Now that his dissecting cherry had been popped, Jerome began to draw the scalpel toward him, cutting a line across the frog's abdomen. That's when the frog's left rear foot twitched. Jerome's hand froze in mid-cut. He remained motionless as he stared at the frog's leg, waiting to see if it would twitch again. Seconds ticked by, but the frog remained still. Probably just a reflex, Jerome told himself. He must have hit a nerve or muscle or something, which in turn caused the leg to move, right? He resumed cutting. The right front foot twitched this time. Jerome felt a crawling sensation on the back of his neck, and he slowly pulled the scalpel away from the frog. The amphibian started screaming. It wasn't the sort of sound an animal would make. It was a very human scream, loud, high-pitched, filled with pain and terror. The frog began thrashing on the cutting board, as if desperate to pull itself free and escape. Its screams continued, increasing in volume, the sounds sending electric chills racing along Jerome's spine. He turned to look for Mr. Hauser, intending to call a teacher over to help him, to deal with the screaming frog. But Jerome saw that he wasn't the only student whose supposedly dead dissection subject had suddenly started showing signs of life. The frogs on all the cutting boards, many of which were in more advanced state of dissection than his, were thrashing about, and all of them were shrieking in agony. Though their frogs were all screaming and thrashing, none of Jerome's fellow students seemed to notice. They kept right on cutting. "You son of a bitch! You sliced me open!" Jerome turned back toward the sound of the tiny voice. His frog had lifted its head and was glaring at him with moist, bulbous eyes. "What did I ever do to you, buddy? One minute I'm minding my own business, hanging out at the edge of my pond, looking to score a few juicy flies for lunch, and the next thing I know, some obnoxious teenager with the scalpel is opening me up!" The frog's voice sounded perfectly human, at first, and then a growl at the end, except that its volume was lower, no doubt due to the size of the mouth, throat, and lungs that produced it. Jerome didn't know what to say, didn't know if even he could speak to address this creature's accusations, so he just stood and stared. "I'll get you, you damn butcher!" The frog tugged its right front leg free of the pins that held it down, ripping off several hunks of skin in the process, then reached down toward the incision Jerome had made. "You want to see my guts so bad? Why don't you take a close-up look?" The frog jammed its small hand into the opening in its abdomen, withdrew a length of intestine, and hurled it at Jerome. The coiled loop flew through the air toward the boy, but since it was still attached to the frog, it drew taut and stopped well short of hitting Jerome. The intestine plopped back onto the frog's open gullet, and the amphibian began thrashing even more violently, as if furious that its throw hadn't reached its tormentor. "Just you wait until I get loose. I'm going to crawl right up your—" Jerome flipped the scalpel around until he was holding it point downward. He gripped the handle tight, and then slammed the blade down into the foul-mouthed frog. Once, twice, 3 times. He continued stabbing the amphibian with increasing ferocity, until there was nothing left but shredded meat and splintered bone. When Jerome finished, he stood for a moment, breathing heavily, and that's when he became aware of the silence. He looked up and saw that his classmates were all staring at him, some with wide-eyed fear, others with amused smirks. But there was one person in the room who clearly was not amused. Mr. Hauser came over to Jerome, his ruddy complexion darkened to beet red. "Just what the hell was that all about, Mr. Starkey?" the biology teacher demanded. Jerome glanced at the other students' frogs. None of them were moving, and from the way they remained pinned down, it looked as if they'd never moved at all. I don't know," Jerome said truthfully. "Really? Well, maybe you'll be able to figure it out in detention tonight." He nodded toward the drawn and quartered amphibian. "Throw that mess away and get a fresh frog. And this time, try not to go psycho on it. Okay, can you do that?" A number of the students laughed as Mr. Hauser walked away, but Jerome wasn't laughing. Not at all. Okay, this has been chapters 4 and 5 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. Anybody else got a craving for frog legs right now? In all seriousness, that was a pretty cool little Freddy dream sequence with the frog. It was kind of hard going back and forth between Freddy's voice and the voice the frog's supposed to be making, but I tried. I hope you all enjoyed today's reading. I'll be back soon with some more chapters of Protege. Can't wait to see how this book turns out. I'm really into it so far. Please be sure to subscribe, drop me a comment, hit the like button, please, people. I really appreciate it if you do that. Spread the word out on social media. Let's let more people know about it. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are coming. And until next time, this has been Storytime with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!